Welcome to the Western Ohio PBIS Network podcast. My name is Brandy Stiegel. You are watching video one of a two-part series that is going to help your PBIS team understand how to use the Tier Fidelity Inventory, or the TFI, to measure the fidelity of the school-wide PBIS implementation. After watching this video, you will understand the features of the Tier 1 TFI. You will understand the process of completing a TFI walkthrough. You will understand each of the items in the Tier 1 TFI to assist your teams in coaching and using the TFI. You will understand the culturally responsive practices that support fidelity. You will understand how to read Tfi reports, and you will understand how to use TFI data to create an action plan. The purpose of the school-wide PBIS TFI is to provide teams with a valid, reliable, and efficient measure of the extent to which school personnel are applying those core features of the school-wide PBIS program and the interventions and support. The TFI is divided into three sections. Tier 1 TFI, or Section 1, will measure the Tier 1 universal school-wide PBIS features, which are there to support 80% of the population, the student population. Section 2 of the TFI will measure the Tier 2 targeted school-wide PBIS features, which are those targeted small group supports that are there to serve 15% of the student population. Section 3 will measure the Tier 3 intensive school-wide PBIS features, which is there to serve at least 5% of the population, and those are those intensive and individualized support. For the purpose of this series, we will only be looking at the Tier 1 and Tier 2 TFI administration. The TFI is usually completed by the school PBIS leadership team, along with a building administrator and an external coach or a district coach or coordinator. It is strongly recommended that the building leadership team work with an external coach or an external facilitator or someone that is outside of the building complete the TFI in order to ensure that the items are objectively scored. Validity research on the TFI shows that school teams are more accurate when an external coach facilitates completion of the TFI. An external coach or facilitator can be a district level coach or a coach or consultant from an outside consultant. Building teams are encouraged to self-assess PBIS implementation during the launch of their initial implementation of PBIS. And then teams should use that TFI and administer that TFI every third or fourth meeting until they reach at least a 70% fidelity across 3 consecutive administrations. Teams should assess each tier of implementation that they have in place. So if a building is only implementing Tier 1 and Tier 2, then they should conduct the TFI to measure the fidelity of their Tier 1 and Tier 2 implementations. Once fidelity on a tier is met, the team may choose to administer the TFI annually as a part of their annual evaluation of the PBIS implementation. We'll talk about those annual evaluations later on in this video. School teams completing the TFI should arrange a TFI walkthrough before completing the actual TFI document. It is recommended that an external coach complete that TFI walkthrough. Building teams that are completing the TFI multiple times per year for progress monitoring purposes may have a staff member complete that TFI walkthrough during one of those administrations. The TFI administration will be more efficient if the team gathers the necessary artifacts prior to conducting that TFI. We will discuss those artifacts later on in this video. After that external coach has conducted the TFI walkthrough, the PBIS team will then schedule a time to actually complete the TFI, and they'll walk through that TFI document and score those artifacts. The TFI can be done using a paper and pencil copy, or it can be completed online using PBIS assessments. In order to complete the online version using PBIS assessments, a person or a representative or a coach must complete a PBIS assessment coordinator application. Using PBIS assessments gives PBIS teams the ability to generate reports, which will make it easier when the team conducts the action plan. After the team has completed the TFI, they should schedule a meeting to analyze the data and create an action plan. The TFI walkthrough is an informal observation of the PBIS Tier I program within the building. The TFI walkthrough is helpful for PBIS teams to understand how well the staff and students understand the school's PBIS implementation. The TFI walkthrough should be completed by an external coach whenever possible. The TFI walkthrough must be completed in order to complete several items on the TFI. So in order to complete items 1.3, 1.4, and 1.9 on the TFI, the data from the TFI walkthrough is needed. So be sure that before you complete the TFI, you sit with the team to complete the TFI, that the TFI walkthrough has been completed. During the TFI walkthrough, the team will use the Tfi Walkthrough Tool to gather information about the school-wide PBIS implementation. This form can be found in the appendix of the TFI, which again can be found on PBIS assessments. And you can download that document. You can print that document off or keep it as a PDF, but you do need that TFI walkthrough from that appendix. As I said, building teams can access the TFI on PBIS assessments. During that interview, an external facilitator will want to interview a minimum of 10% of the staff or a minimum of 5 teachers. That external facilitator is also going to want to interview a minimum of 10% of the students or a minimum of 10 students. During these short interviews, the facilitator will ask students and staff about the school's PBIS implementation to gauge how well the staff and students understand the school-wide expectations and the school's acknowledgement systems. When they are going through this document, the team is going to ask the students to explain what the school's expectations are. So a student may say, our expectations are PAWS or DOGS or whatever acronym. If a student uses the acronym, then the facilitator is going to want to have the student elaborate and tell exactly what each of those letters what those letters stand for and which expectations those letters represent. The facilitator is also going to ask the students about their acknowledgement system. When's the last time you received whatever that acknowledgement system is? When is the last time you received a coupon or a Bulldog buck or whatever that acknowledgement system? They're going to do the same thing with the teachers. They're going to ask the teachers, what are their school-wide expectations? And again, they're going to want to make sure that the teachers know exactly what those expectations mean. They're going to ask the teachers to tell how often they are giving out those acknowledgments. And so they want to know how many times the teacher has distributed whatever that acknowledgement is in that acknowledgement system. Prior to conducting the TFI walkthrough, external coaches should collect information about the school's PBIS implementation. The facilitator will want to talk to an administrator or someone from the PBIS team to learn more about that school-wide PBIS implementation, such as needing to know what the school expectations are called, what are the expectations, and they need to know information about the acknowledgement system. The facilitator will use this information to guide their questions during the PBIS walkthrough. I'm going to drop some links in the description box to send you to some videos that will give you demonstrations of how to conduct those walkthroughs with students and staff. So let's go ahead and jump into the actual TFI. So the TFI is divided into the format that you see here. The first column, you will see the feature, the feature name. This will give a detailed description of the feature. The middle column will give possible data sources. This is going to let the team know what data sources that may be helpful in scoring this item. And then the third column will give the scoring criteria. Keep in mind that as you are planning your PBIS implementation and as you are going through, you're having your meetings, you are creating agendas, you want to keep that information organized. One, because it will be easier when you are getting ready to do the TFI and you'll be able to access those documents easily. They'll be organized in a way where you can look through them and you can make those decisions quickly. But also, you want to be able to archive what you're doing so that if a team changes, if the team membership changes, or if there are new members to the team, that someone could be able to understand what that team has accomplished throughout their time. So the TFI is broken into 3 subscales. The first subscale allows the school-wide PBIS team to analyze features pertaining to their team composition and their team operating procedures. The second subscale focuses on the PBIS implementation itself. It's going to look at behavioral expectations, teaching expectations, problem behaviors, discipline policies, professional development, classroom procedures, feedback and acknowledgement, faculty involvement, student, family, community engagement, as well as how the teams are using discipline data. The last subscale is going to look at how the team uses data to drive their implementation. So the team is going to be looking at how they make database decisions, how they use Fidelity data, and how they are conducting those annual evaluations. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look in a second, we're going to look at each of those features later on in the video. But before we do, let's talk about cultural responsiveness and PBIS. So while assessing the fidelity of their PBIS implementations, teams should also examine their systems and practices to ensure that they are culturally responsive. Building culturally responsive environments requires that the teams have an understanding of how their school systems have been established and how well these systems are supporting students from diverse cultures. When schools weave cultural responsiveness into their PBIS framework, this means that they are holding high expectations for all students. They are using students' cultures and experiences to enhance their learning. They are providing all students with access to effective instruction and adequate resources for learning. They are using this implementation and these systems to change the school's culture and to enhance educational equity. Throughout this course, we will look at examples of culturally relevant practices for each TFI item. The Center for PBIS has identified 5 key components of culturally responsive PBIS frameworks. They are identity, voice, supportive environment, situational appropriateness, and data for equity. So let's break down what each of these mean. Identity means that a person's identity is comprised of multiple aspects, which includes their race, their ethnicity, and other aspects of their culture, such as their ability, their gender, their language, their marital status, their religion, their sexual orientation, their socioeconomic status, and there could be other things. Culturally responsive schools that embed and focus on identity awareness are very conscious of those various critical identities that exist within their organization, and they understand how these identities influence their classrooms and schools on a daily basis. When we say voice means that teams ensure that they engage families and communities by providing those families, students, and community members with meaningful opportunities to be heard and voice their opinions and exercise agency and leadership within the school system. When we talk about supportive environments, we understand that PBIS teams are responsible for helping to establish those systems that are going to create those supportive environments. Implementing the school-wide PBIS system with fidelity can ensure that staff and students have the skills to be successful within those supportive environments. Situational appropriateness is the ability to determine what types of behaviors will ensure positive outcomes in a given setting, and the students understand when to demonstrate those skills, and they are able to demonstrate those skills that are going to allow them to be successful with fluency. Culturally responsive PBIS frameworks ensures that students are explicitly taught the behaviors as well as when and in what context or settings to demonstrate those behaviors that are going to help them to be successful. Culturally, so now when we say data for equity, what this means is culturally responsive PBIS systems are based on an understanding that it is imperative to use data to drive decision making and action planning. Analyzing data helps teams to ensure that their practices are equitable and that they are serving the needs of all of their students. Throughout this video, we will discuss examples of culturally responsive practices for each TFI, Tier 1 TFI item. So let's go ahead and jump into the actual TFI. So item 1.1 focuses on team composition. So the feature described is that Tier 1 teams include a Tier 1 systems coordinator, a school administrator, a family member, and individuals able to provide A, applied behavioral expertise, B, coaching expertise, C, knowledge of student academic and behavior patterns, D, knowledge about the operations of the school across grade levels and programs and for high schools, and E, student representation. Now, again, the middle column gives the data sources that that team can use. So they can use their school organizational chart. They can use their Tier 1 team meeting minutes, any documents that support and identify who is exactly on the team. So a team will receive a 0 if the Tier 1 team does not exist or does not include a coordinator, school administrator, or individuals with applied behavioral expertise. They'll receive a 1 if the Tier 1 team exists but does not include all identified roles or attendance of these members is below 80%. And then they'll receive a 2 if the Tier 1 team exists with a coordinator, an administrator, and all identified roles represented, and attendance of all roles is at or above 80%. Now, as you are going through the TFI, you want to pay attention to the conjunctions used within the scoring criteria, because in some criteria, you may see the word or, but in the higher scores, you may see the word and. So you want to pay attention, because if you see the word and, all of those elements need to exist. All of those elements in that feature need to exist. So you always want to think, again, as you are planning your implementation, as you're having those meetings. Again, I cannot emphasize, you want to make sure you keep all of your documentation organized, your meeting minutes are organized, your agendas are kept organized, your roles are identified, and you keep this in an organized manner. There are tons of templates throughout that you can find on the web that will help you understand what an agenda looks like, what a meeting agenda should look like, what your team meeting minutes should look like. So I encourage everyone to go out and find templates to help support that organization. Now, some guiding questions for item 1.1 for teams to think about is: have all team members attended initial PBIS Tier 1 professional development? Has alignment, integration, and an integration with other behavior-related initiatives and programs been ensured? Have backup members been identified if the facilitator, the recorder, or a data analyst is absent? So if there's someone missing from the team, do we have substitutes available for them to take their place? Substitute team members, let me say. Has the PBIS team discussed forming subcommittees to assist with the Tier 1 implementation and to build capacity for sustainability? Does the school and PBIS team have a process in place to ensure new team members are added to the team annually? Is there a process in place to sustain PBIS work when key members leave? If one or two people on the team are doing the majority of the work, how does the team ensure that the workload is shared by all? Now, when we talk about culturally responsive practices for this item, we want to look at voice. So the first culturally responsive practice that we'll talk about is school teams should include family and student subcommittees or access to grade level family subcommittees. Family and student participation and roles are clearly outlined, defined, and understood by the family and student representative teams and the PBIS teams. Families should have ownership of systems components, i.e., celebrations and acknowledgments. Families should be able to assist in reporting team meeting discussions and data to stakeholders. Again, remember, voice means we are engaging our stakeholders, meaning our families, our students, our community. And then lastly, family feedback is sought regarding school processes such as hiring and other policies. Item 1.2 is going to be looking at team operating procedures. This item says that Tier 1 teams meet at least monthly and has a regular meeting format and agenda. They have meeting minutes, they have defined meeting roles, and they have a current action plan. Keep in mind it says current. The possible data sources for that are those Tier 1 team meeting agendas and or those meeting minutes, that the Tier 1 meeting roles. They have those descriptions. They've assigned those roles to the team members, and they have that Tier 1 current action plan. So they can use those as possible data sources. So a score of a 0 would mean that the Tier 1 team does not use regular meeting formats and agendas. There are no meeting minutes, there's no defined roles, or there's not a current action plan. A score of a 1 means that the Tier 1 team has at least 2, but not all 4 features. And then a score of a 2 means that the Tier 1 team meets at least monthly and uses regular meeting formats and agenda minutes, defined roles, and has a current action plan. So some guiding questions for item 1.2. Is there a central location where all PBS related documents are accessible and editable to all PBIS team members? This could mean that these items are stored on your Google Drive, Edmodo, there's a physical binder somewhere, but that these documents are readily accessible to the team. Is there a process in place for disseminating PBIS information during grade level team-based meetings, building level teams, or staff meeting, building leadership teams, or staff meetings? So how are we distributing this information to team-based teams, building level teams, staff meetings, family meetings? How are we getting that information out? And then the last question is, does the PBIS team review and update action plan items monthly, including adding an additional action step when previous action steps are completed? So we will look at what that action plan looks like further down in the video. So some culturally responsive practices that in this case support creating a supportive environment means that the team is going to focus on changing the systems rather than students, and engage in explicit conversations around ethnicity and race and effects of practices on all student enrollment groups. So they understand how those systems they are creating impact all of their diverse students. The team ensures that meeting minutes, goals, data, and decisions are shared with stakeholders and are readily accessible. The teams have ongoing timely procedures for family, students, and community members to communicate questions, concerns, or needs. And the team regularly reviews procedures for utilization and effectiveness with stakeholders. Item 1.3 is going to look at behavioral expectations. The feature is described as schools have 5 or fewer positively stated behavioral expectations than examples by setting and location for students and staff behaviors, i.e., they have a teaching matrix defined and in place. Now, remember from your Tier 1 training that for early elementary or for early childhood, schools should have less than 5. So they should have about 3 expectations. For school age, they should have 3 to 5 expectations, okay? So some possible data sources could be that TFI walkthrough. And remember, I said that there are some items that you need that TFI walkthrough in order to score. This is one of those items, the staff handbook or even the student handbook. Now, a team will receive a 0 if the behavioral expectations have not been identified, they are not all positively stated, and or rather, there are more than 5 in number. A team receives a 1 if the behavioral expectations are identified, but may not include a matrix or be posted. And they will receive a 2 if There are 5 or fewer behavioral expectations that exist. They are positively stated. They are identified for specific settings. There is a matrix, and at least 90% of the staff can list at least 67% of the expectations. So some guiding questions for item 1.3 is, has the team identified 5 or fewer behavioral expectations? Do they include examples by location and setting? Are they publicly posted throughout the school? So let's talk about culturally responsive practices for this item. In this case, for this item, we're going to look at situational appropriateness. So this means that teams provide staff and community with periodic orientation and opportunities to examine and give input regarding school-wide expectations and rules to ensure that they reflect the values and the norms of the communities that they're serving. Teams examine their expectations and rules to look for implicit bias to ensure that the expectations are truly universal. Families and students are given opportunities to examine and give feedback on the school-wide expectations and rules before implementing and at least annually after implementation. Expectations and rules are included in family and student orientation materials, including explicit statements on possible differences between school and home, letting them understand the behavior expectations may differ from school and at home. School staff model expectations and refer to them regularly in their daily interactions. All right, so let's look at item 1.4, which is teaching expectations. This feature says that expected academic and social behaviors are taught directly to all students in classroom and across other campus settings and locations. So again, this is another item where that TFI walkthrough data is going to be needed. So some possible data sources is that TFI walkthrough tool, the professional development calendar, those lesson plans that were created to teach those expectations, and the informal walkthrough data that the PBIS team is gathering as they're going and observing the PBIS implementation in action to make sure that it is actually being implemented. So a team receives a 0 if the expected behaviors are not taught. They receive a 1 if the expected behaviors are taught informally or inconsistently. They will receive a 2 if there is a formal system with written schedule is used to teach expected behaviors directly to students across classroom and campus settings. And keep in mind, notice that and at least 70% of the students can list at least 67% of the expectations. So again, pay attention to that word and. So some guiding questions for item 1.4 is, have dates been identified when lessons will be taught and retaught throughout the school year? So have we identified when we're going to teach those initial lessons to teach the expectations, and when are we going to use those booster lessons to reteach those expectations? Are dates and times included on the school's professional development calendar? So we've done our upfront work and planned out that professional development that we're going to use for those staff and personnel? Who will be responsible for teaching lessons in each setting? Will it be the teachers, the assistants, the related service providers? Will it be families? Who's going to be responsible for that? Are the behavioral expectations embedded in routines, activities, interactions on a daily basis? Are a variety of teaching strategies being used to teach those expectations? Are materials used in a way that promotes social, emotional development and guide appropriate behavior? Is there a plan for teaching expectations to new students, new staff members, substitutes, volunteers who entered the school during the school year? This is very important to think about, especially if you are a school that has a high transition rate where new kids are enrolling consistently or new teachers are coming in, volunteers are coming in throughout the year. You want to ensure that you have a plan in place to teach those expectations and about that PBIS implementation. So some culturally responsive practices to ensure situational appropriateness for this item is that expectation lesson plans incorporate students' real life experience, cultural strengths, and values of the students. The team should examine expectations for reflection of dominant cultural values that may need explicit teachings, and if found, define the logical rationale for those expectations and plan for explicitly teaching it to all students. The team should provide opportunities for students to articulate their expectations at home and discuss the similarities and differences between their expectations at home and those expectations in the school. Staff should include students actively in the lesson plan design and delivery. Again, this also goes into that conversation about voice. Teams should seek regular feedback on lesson plans from school staff, students, family, and community members, all of the stakeholders. Teams include family and community members as teachers of the behavior expectations. The school staff should use the validate, affirm, build, and bridge approach to or other specific strategies to build from students' learning histories. Now, if you haven't had a chance to look at the culturally responsive practices field guide for coaches that is on pbis.org, I advise you to take a look at that. I will drop a link for that as well in the description box. So I'll try to make sure I drop links to all of the documents that we're referencing, that so you can go in and find those documents. And lastly, teams and school staff provide materials for families so that they can define and teach behavior expectations in the home in ways that fit their needs. So again, we're working to bridge that connection between the expectations that are taught in the home and the expectations that are taught in the school. So 1.5 is going to look at problem behavior definitions. The item description says that the school has clear definitions for behaviors that interfere with academic and social success, and a clear policy and procedure for addressing office managed versus staff managed problems is in place, i.e. that flow chart that should have been created during your initial planning. So some possible data sources for this would be the staff handbook, the student handbook, the school policy, or that discipline flow chart. So a team gets a 0 if there are no clear definitions that exist and procedures to manage problems are not clearly defined. The team receives a 1 if the definitions and procedures exist but are not clear and or not organized by staff versus office managed problems. And the team will receive a 2 if the definitions and procedures for managing problems are clearly defined, documented, and shared with the family. So some guiding questions for item 1.5 is there a process for staff to problem solve around problem behaviors and to respond to crisis situations? Has a flow chart been created? Does the flow chart include a continuum of preventive and responsive strategies to support student behavior? Has all staff been trained in implementing the flow chart procedures? Has that flow chart been shared with families and students? So it's very important that that flow chart that helps teachers understand how to respond to behaviors is in place. It's very important that those office versus staff managed behaviors have been identified and that all staff understand what those are. So some culturally responsive practices that will help to encourage situational appropriateness is that 1, teams actively seek input on problem behavior definitions, especially subjective behaviors such as defiance or disrespect, because we know that those could mean different things to different people. So from school staff, students, families, community members, and school staff. So we want to make sure we have input on what those things could be. So teams provide information and seek feedback in multiple languages and modes of delivery, i.e. they get feedback from written surveys, from audio surveys, visual, however they're going to conduct feedback. They're doing this in multiple modes of delivery and making sure that if they have a number of different languages that are first languages within their schools, then they're sending that feedback, they're soliciting that feedback in those multiple languages. So teams actively seek consensus among staff members with response to problem behavior by revisiting and practicing the procedures at least annually or as data indicates is needed. And then lastly, the teams work with school staff to develop categories for behavior that include staff managed, office managed, and situationally inappropriate behaviors. So 1.6 is going to look at those discipline policies. So 1.6 says the school policies and procedures describe and emphasize proactive, instructive, and or restorative approaches to student behavior that are implemented consistently. So some possible data sources could be that discipline policy, that student handbook, the code of conduct, or an informal administrator interview. So a 0 means that the documents contain only reactive and punitive consequences. A 1 means the documentation includes and emphasizes proactive approaches. And a 2 means that documentation includes and emphasizes proactive approaches, and administrators' reports show that these are used consistently. So some guiding questions for 1.6 is, are disciplinary practices proactive, preventative, and developmentally appropriate? Do they incorporate reteaching the expected behaviors when missteps or behavioral errors occur? Are strategies, i.e. initiating parent contact, promoting and reteaching appropriate behavior, in place for partnering with families when a problem behavior occurs? Are practices focused on helping children stay in school and the classroom, or is there a reliance on those exclusionary practices? If you want to learn more about those research-based effective practices, I do have videos on the Western Ohio YouTube page that will help you understand what those effective practices are. All right, so some culturally responsive practices for item 1.6 include creating a supportive environment. So in this case, teams and staff should review existing discipline policies to ensure that inclusionary practices are used whenever possible, and that exclusionary practices are used with discretion for safety purposes only, and always with an instructional component. Another culturally responsive practice is teams actively should seek input from families and the community on discipline policies and attempt to align disciplinary procedures with the expectations of students, families, and their communities. Another culturally responsive practice is that teams should have procedures for staff to respond to unwanted behaviors by assessing whether the behavior is culturally situated, bridging expectations across school and home, and reteaching those skills as needed with additional practice, acknowledgement, and a focus on affirming student strengths and restoring relationships. Teams should work with local law enforcement agencies to emphasize positive interactions between authority figures and students, as opposed to negative or threatening interactions when problem behaviors occur. So again, if you have not had a chance to check out the videos, the effective practice videos on the web, on the YouTube page, I encourage you to do so to understand what those practices look like. So item 1.7 addresses professional development. The professional development feature for this item says that a written process is used for orienting all faculty and staff on 4 core Tier 1 school-wide PBIS practices. 1, teaching school-wide expectations, acknowledging appropriate behavior, correcting errors, and requesting assistance. Some possible data sources for this could be the professional development calendar or the staff handbook. So a team will receive a 0 if there's no process for teaching staff in place. The team will receive a 1 if the process is informal or unwritten and is not a part of the professional development calendar and or does not include all staff or all 4 core Tier 1 practices. A team can receive a 2 if there is a formal process for teaching all staff, all aspects of Tier 1 systems, including all 4 core Tier 1 practices. Now, some guiding questions for item 1.7 is there an all-staff orientation scheduled each year, led by that Tier 1 team, to reteach expectations rules, teaching scripts, acknowledgement systems, discipline systems, including the flow chart, how to request for assistance around behavioral concerns? Again, this is going to require in that planning that there is some forward thinking and some long-term thinking about what those professional development needs are going to be. The second guiding question: is there a new staff orientation scheduled each year to teach expectations, rules, and teaching scripts, acknowledgement systems, discipline systems, etc., for those new staff that will be joining the faculty? Is there a written plan for orienting staff, substitutes, volunteers, or anyone that's going to be entering into that building? Now we are moving into this space where we understand that every adult that works in that building or within that district, whether it's the bus drivers, the cafeteria workers, the custodial workers, all should be have an understanding of that school-wide PBIS program. So it's very important to think about how are you going to train those people to understand the school-wide PBIS implementation. Is there a written plan and schedule developed for teachers for teaching students the expectations and rules? And has acknowledgement schedules been developed and shared with student staffs and family? So some culturally responsive practices. This one will focus on identity for that item. The district should have a long-term professional development plan that includes school-wide PBIS and is focused on enhancing equity. The professional development opportunities should be identified based on the system and the student's outcome data. Teams should partner with their local community supports and families to provide professional development that orients staff to the community cultures, the values, and the historical perspectives. The team should have procedures to provide staff with explicit training and practice in specific skills for enhancing equity and examining bias, implicit bias. Teams should have procedures to provide staff with explicit training and practice in those de-escalation skills and techniques. So 1.8 is going to focus on those classroom procedures. The feature says that Tier 1 features school-wide expectations, routines, acknowledgments, in-class continuum of consequences are implemented within classroom and consistent with the school-wide systems. So some possible data sources is going to be the handbook, the staff handbook, the informal walkthroughs that administrator or that PBIS leadership is going to do to ensure that implementation is actually happening, whatever progress monitoring tools that team puts in place, and that individual classroom data. If you remember back to your Tier 1 training, there should be a policy or a data process put in place where you can capture what's happening and the behaviors that are happening in the classroom. So either you've created some type of discipline log or you have some type of software that allows teachers to enter and staff to enter in those discipline issues that may not actually result in an office discipline referral, but are those opportunities for those teachers to reteach. So any type of behavioral errors that are happening in the classroom, there should be a way to track those. So for scoring, the team will get a 0 if the classrooms are not implementing Tier 1 PBIS. They get a 1 if the classrooms are informally implementing Tier 1, but no formal system exists. And then there's a 2 if the classroom are formally implementing all 4 core Tier 1 features consistent with those school-wide expectations. Now, some guiding questions would be, are expected classroom behaviors and routines being taught? Have classroom procedures been developed and explicitly taught for activities where problems often occur? Do classroom staff deliver the behavior-specific praise? Are they giving that specific positive praise for students immediately after students demonstrate expected behaviors at a minimum of 4-to-1 ratio for that specific positive feedback to negative feedback? So remember, that's a very important component of the PBIS program for students to be able to connect those desired behaviors with that acknowledgement or that specific positive feedback. Do procedures exist for tracking classroom behavior problems? When behavior problems occur, do staff assess whether student misbehavior is a deficit of awareness or skill? Is the continuum of strategies followed consistently to correct and reteach inappropriate behavior? Do classrooms have a range of developmentally appropriate consequences and interventions for problem behaviors that are documented and consistently delivered? Does the classroom staff consistently follow school-wide procedures for classroom managed and office managed behaviors? And has the PBIS team or administration determined a method for monitoring progress in the classroom? So again, this is one of those things that's going to be very important that teams really think about their professional development and ensuring that the teachers have been trained in those effective classroom practices. and that they understand how to encourage appropriate behavior and discourage inappropriate behavior. So some culturally responsive practices that are going to help to build a supportive environment based on this item is that teachers post images of successful persons from underrepresented groups filling professional roles in the classroom. Students see themselves and their experiences in classroom imaging as contributed by families and materials. They have culturally specific libraries. Teachers should encourage students to share elements of their culture and their family history in class. Teachers should use a variety of attention or transition signals, whether it be song lyrics, call and response, motor breaks, use of home languages, and a range of instructional methods appropriate to the content area and the developmental level of the students um, for instruction. So again, teachers should use the validate, affirm, build, bridge approach to prevent and address issues of cultural differences. Teachers engage in frequent two-way and positive communication with families regarding classroom procedures and student progress in multiple languages and modes of delivery. Item 1.9 is focusing on feedback and acknowledgement. So this feature says that a formal system, i.e. written set of procedures for specific behavior feedback that is A, linked to the school-wide expectations and B, used across settings and within classroom is in place and used by at least 90% of a sample of staff and received by at least 50% of a sample staff. So this again is another one of those items that will require that data from that TFI walkthrough tool. So possible data sources, of course, is that TFI walkthrough tool data, as well as the staff handbook. So a team will receive a 0 if there's no formal system for acknowledging students, a 1 if the formal system is in place and is used by at least 90% of the staff or is received by at least 50% of the students, and a 2 if the formal system for acknowledging student behavior is used by at least 90% of the staff and is received by at least 50% of the students. So again, pay attention between that 1 and that 2. The difference is the word or and for that team to get a 2, there needs to be an and at both of those things present. And again, that is going to be present and be able to be documented via that TFI walkthrough too. So some guiding questions for this item is that first, is the system of acknowledgement developmentally appropriate? So for young children, this should not be expected. They should not be expected to keep track of individual tickets or tokens. Are those expectations developmentally appropriate for their age? So there may be different expectations that you would use in an early childhood program versus that which you would use in a school age program. Is the data collected to determine who is and is not receiving or participating in rewards? So we should always know who's receiving acknowledgement and who has not. And if you remember back to your Tier 1 training, if there is a student that is not receiving any acknowledgments, then we need to go back and look at what we're doing with that student. Are we giving them specific positive feedback? Are we reteaching expectations? Every child should be set up with the opportunity to receive acknowledgments. And if they are not, then we need to look at the support and interventions that we're providing to that student. Are there a variety of methods used to reward students? Are acknowledgments varied to maintain student interest? Are ratios of acknowledgments to corrections high? Are we using that 4-to-1? Specific positive feedback for positive specific feedback to every 1 negative corrective feedback. Are students involved in identifying and developing incentives? Does the system include incentives for staff and faculty? Always remember that we need to be very aware of the students that we're serving when we're creating these acknowledgement systems so that we are capturing their interests and that our acknowledgement systems match with those things that are going to increase the probability that we're going to see those desired behaviors. So some culturally responsive practices. In this case, we're going to be looking at that component of supportive environment. Teams actively seek feedback from students, families, and the community about preferences for acknowledgement and perceptions of the current systems at least annually. Teams actively seek connections within the community for the acknowledgement system to be reinforced, i.e., the use of reinforcements in community settings such as restaurants. So they're connecting with those outside partners to be able to either donate things or allow students to give out coupons, whatever we can do to engage that community around us and our community partners. Teams assess racial and ethnic equity in acknowledgement systems, i.e., rewards used consistently with all groups of students with valid tools, i.e., that Tfi Walkthrough, those stakeholder input and satisfaction surveys multiple times throughout the year. And for students who have received multiple referrals, that team is auditing the frequency and the use of the acknowledgement and feedback in the reteaching process. So we are going back and we're identifying, we're going and problem solving when we see that students are not responding to our Tier 1 universal practices. So 1.10 is going to look at faculty involvement. Faculty, this one says that faculty are shown school-wide data regularly and provide input on universal foundations. This means, for example, expectations, acknowledgments, definitions, consequences at least every 12 months. So the possible data sources for this could be any of the surveys that you can use from PBIS self-assessment surveys. They have that self-assessment survey, which is also called the SAS. There are school climate surveys. There's data that you can collect using that PBIS assessment. And so look out in the future. There will be some videos around that. You can use those informal surveys. You can use staff meeting minutes or team meeting minutes. And again, the goal is to make sure that these things are documented and you're really being intentional about what you're documenting in your meeting minutes, whether it be for a staff meeting or a team meeting. So a team will receive a 0 if the faculty are not shown data at least yearly and do not provide input. The team receives a 1 if the faculty have been shown data more than yearly or have provided feedback on Tier 1 foundations within the past 12 months, but not both. The team will receive a 2 if the faculty are shown data at least 4 times per year and have been provided feedback on Tier 1 practices within the past 12 months. So some guiding questions for item 1.10 is, 1, is there a documentation of a process for establishing buy-in and receiving feedback on Tier 1 supports? Remember, we need a majority of our staff to buy in for any school initiative to work. We need that 80% of the staff to buy in. We need to, number 2, how often is school discipline data shared with all staff in your school? Research shows that when you share your discipline data with all staff at least monthly, schools are more likely to sustain those PBIS efforts. Third question, does data inform decisions, i.e., is the team using staff surveys to capture that feedback? Are they using Fidelity assessments such as the TFI to gauge how well they're implementing that PBIS implementation? Are they collecting data from climate surveys that they are administering to students, families, and teachers? It's important that they collect this data and they're eliciting that feedback. Another guiding question is, are staff involved in establishing and or reviewing goals? Are changes made based on faculty feedback? Another thing is, what is the feedback loop to grade level, department, and other teams in the school about PBIS implementation? What is our communication systems? How are we communicating what we are doing as a PBIS team to our staff, to our families, to our communities? Is there a central location where all PBIS related documents are accessible to staff? We want to be transparent. We want the staff to understand what the team is doing, and they should be able to have feedback and be able to review documents so that they are in the loop and can provide that feedback. And you'll more likely get more buy-in if the process is transparent. So some culturally responsive practices that help to provide voice is that teams have a process for frequently facilitating that two-way communication between the school administration, the leadership team, and the faculty. Teams have procedures for school staff to play an active role in planning and delivery of school-wide activities. School staff are acknowledged for their participation in school-wide PBIS systems, And teams collect and use feedback from school staff regarding their perceptions of and suggestions for Tier 1 school-wide PBIS systems at least annually. So 1.11 is going to deal with student, family, and community involvement. So this feature says that stakeholders, students, and families and communities provide input on universal foundations, for example, expectations, consequences, acknowledgement, at least every 12 months. So some possible data sources to make sure this is happening are those surveys that we're going to administer to our stakeholders, voting results from parent and family meetings, and then team meeting results. So the team receives a 0 if there's no documentation or no opportunities for stakeholder feedback on Tier 1 foundations. They'll receive a 1 if the documentation of input on Tier 1 foundations exists, but not within the past 12 months, or input exists, but not from all types of stakeholders. They'll receive a 2 if the documentation exists, that students, families, and community members have provided feedback on Tier 1 practices within the past 12 months. And again, I cannot stress enough how important it is to ensure that you are giving your stakeholders voice. That is a culturally responsive practice, and there are a lot of tools that you can find on PBIS assessments that can help you engage your stakeholders. So some guiding questions are plans for involving family and communities developed and implemented. And again, this is something that as you are creating that Tier 1 implementation and creating that plan for that Tier 1 implementation, that you want to be very intentional about putting in systems that allow you to collect and track feedback from your stakeholders. Is feedback obtained from school community, staff, students, and families? Has a student PBIS team been established to help with implementation, giving students voice? Are strategies to share key features with families and community developed and implemented? So are we implementing what we said we were going to implement? So some culturally responsive practices that will help create voice for your family and stakeholder engagement are teams research their communities to determine which ethnic groups are represented within that broad federal race category. We understand who we're serving. Teams have procedures for specific community outreach actions to ensure frequent two-way communication with stakeholders. Teams have procedures in place to inform families and community members of and actively engage them in volunteer opportunities within the school. Teams actively seek feedback from stakeholders regarding their perceptions of and suggestions for Tier 1 school-wide PBIS systems at least annually. Teams have procedures to ensure that stakeholders and community resources are connected to Tier 1 school-wide PBIS systems, including increasing students and families' access to resources that specifically address underrepresented ethnicity groups or underserved populations. And lastly, teams share all information with their stakeholders in multiple language and modes of delivery. 1.12 is going to look at discipline data. So this one says that Tier 1 has instantaneous access to graph reports summarizing discipline data organized by the frequency of problem behavior events by behavior, location, time of day, and by individual students. So some of that could be the school policy, the team meeting minutes, as well as that student outcome data. So we should be able to, whatever software or student information system that you're using, you should be able to generate reports to help you analyze trends and look at that data. And when we say student outcome data, we mean academic data, whether it's classroom grades, standardized testing. We mean attendance data. We mean behavior, office discipline referrals, those classroom discipline data logs. All of that we're using to help guide some of our decisions. So a team receives a 0 if there's no centralized data system with ongoing decision making that exists. Their team will receive a 1 if the data system exists but does not allow instantaneous access to full sets of graph reports. And the team receives a 2 if the discipline data system exists that allows instantaneous access to graphs of frequency of problem behavior events by behavior, location, time of day, and student. So it's very important that schools decide which type of student information system that they're going to select. There are various companies that you can reach out to get demonstrations of those systems, whether it be Swiss, which you can find on PBIS apps, I believe Kickboard. There are a number of different things that you can look for, and this is going to involve you all looking what's best for your school. So some guiding questions about 1.12 is, are data systems used to collect and analyze office discipline referrals data? Are we looking at those office discipline referral data? Are we collecting additional data? Are we looking at attendance, grades, faculty attendance, visits to nurse, surveys? Is that PBIS team using that? And you want to have as many pieces of data as you can, because you want to tell a story and you want to make sure that you're working towards those goals you set, those outcomes that you want to achieve. So the culturally responsive practices that are aligned with this item are data for equity. So the first practice is that teams disaggregate the data in their core reports by race and ethnicity and disability status quarterly. So we are disaggregating that data and we're looking at our various subgroups and how our subgroups are responding to our implementation. Teams calculate multiple disproportionality metrics, i.e. risk ratios for office discipline referrals, suspensions, achievement, and special education placement at least quarterly. We should be looking at our disproportionality to make sure that we're not disproportionately referring students to the office from one particular subgroup, or we're not disproportionately assigning consequences to a certain subgroup. We should be looking at disproportionality in all things with our school and not just discipline. So teams review administrative consequences, decisions for disparity at least monthly. Teams examine trends in disaggregated data to identify specific situations when disproportionality is more likely to be evident. So that means the behaviors, the locations, the times of day. We're looking at that. We're looking at those big fives, where are our referrals happening in the building, what time of the day, what day of the week, who are we mainly seeing? Is it the sixth graders, the fourth graders? Who are we mainly seeing? What is the motivation? Why do we think this is? What is the motivation behind these behaviors? And again, I have a great video on the YouTube channel, The Science of Behaviors, that can help you understand the motivation of that behavior. So we want to be looking at all of those big fives to understand what's happening and why it's happening, and to be able to tell a story and be able to adjust our policies and maybe our procedures to address those issues. So teams should research their communities to determine which ethnic groups are represented within that broad federal race category, and use that information to make practices more culturally responsive. Item 1.13 is going to look at data-based decision-making. This says that the Tier I team reviews and uses discipline data and academic outcome data, curriculum-based measures, state tests at least monthly for decision-making. So the data that could be used, or the sources of data sources that could be used for this, could be your data decision rules, which should have been created when you are creating that implementation, that PBIS implementation plan, the staff professional development calendar, the staff handbook, and the team meeting minutes. So a team receives a 0 if there's no process or protocol exists, or data is reviewed but not used. The team will receive a 1 if the data is reviewed and used for decision making but less than monthly. And the team receives a 2 if the team reviews discipline data and uses data for decision making at least monthly. If the data indicates an academic or behavior problem, an action plan is developed to enhance or modify the Tier I supports. Now, always remember that your action plan is a living document. So that means that that document, as the data tells you that there is something that needs to be changed, that there is an action that needs to happen. We're not strong in this area, so we need to change this. It needs to be changed. When you complete an action and you've actually come and you now are receiving a 2 in that area, then you can remove that off your checklist. But that action plan is a living document and should constantly be evolving as your data suggests. So item 1.3 guiding questions include, does the team have access to discipline data for the entire student body? Does the team have access to academic data for the entire student body? So we want to make sure they have discipline as well as academic data. And does the team disaggregate data to inform and monitor equitable practices? So some culturally responsive practices around using data for equity. would be one, teams have procedures to ensure that the data is shared frequently with stakeholders for input and feedback. The teams examine the data for patterns that would indicate a need for systemic change versus student intervention. So we're looking at things that are systemic problems versus things that may be problems with where a student may need some intervention. The last thing is when concerning patterns are noted, teams develop action plans with short-term goals, i.e., things that are going to require an immediate response, and long-term goals, which are going to require information gathering, professional development solutions, and that's going to require more intensive solutions to that, what we're seeing or with those problems. So item 1.14 is dealing with fidelity data. So Tier 1 teams review and use school-wide PBIS fidelity data, such as the set, the benchmarks of quality, the team implementation checklist, the self-assessment survey, the tiered fidelity inventory data at least annually. And as you'll note when you go into PBIS assessment, the tiered fidelity was created to kind of combine older fidelity tools such as a set and the benchmarks of quality and the team implementation checklist. So teams don't necessarily need to use that. They can use the TFI to capture that fidelity data. The self-assessment survey is an individual survey that's given to the teachers to get their perception of that PBIS implementation. So some possible data sources to look at that would, of course, be the school policy, the staff handbook, the school newsletter, the school website, as well as data from those fidelity tools that you're using. So a team will get a 0 if no Tier 1 school-wide PBIS fidelity data is collected. That team would receive a 1 if the Tier 1 fidelity data is collected informally and or less often than annually. And the team will receive a 2 if the Tier 1 fidelity data is collected and used for decision-making annually. So some guiding questions for that item is the fidelity data used for decision-making and action planning at Tier 1? Is the Tier 1 fidelity measure acceptable? Completing this inventory meets the criterion for a 2 on that TFI. So are we using fidelity measures that are really valid and helping us understand what's happening in our building? So some culturally responsive practices that ensure data for equity is one that teams collect additional data when completing site visits or site evaluations via that school-wide evaluation tool, which we call SET, or the Tfi Walkthrough, ensuring that there's representativeness of interviewees, assessing evidence of cultural imaging during observations. The second practice would be teams have procedures to collect and use feedback from students, families, and community members regarding perceptions of fidelity implementation for continuous improvement. Again, making sure that we're listening to our stakeholders. And the teams collect feedback in multiple language and modes of delivery. And as you see, that's a practice that we will see, a culturally responsive practice that we see throughout all of the PBIS implementation, that has to happen. So the last item is item 1.15, which is the annual evaluation. So this says that Tier 1 team documents fidelity and effectiveness, including on academic outcomes of Tier 1 practices at least annually, including year-by-year comparisons that are shared in a usable format with stakeholders, which include staff, families, community, and districts. So essentially, we are creating that end-of-year report that goes out to our communities, our stakeholders, which include families and staff as well. So some possible data sources are the staff, student, and family surveys, the Tier 1 handbook, the fidelity tools, that data from that, the school policy, the student outcomes, the district reports, and the school letters. So a team will get a 0 if no evaluation takes place or evaluation occurs without data. A team would receive a 1 if the evaluation is conducted but not annually, or outcomes are not used to shape the Tier 1 process and or are not shared with stakeholders. A team will receive a 2 if the evaluation is conducted at least annually and outcomes, including academics, are shared with stakeholders with clear alterations in process based on evaluation. So think of this annual evaluation like a state of the school. It lets the stakeholders know what's happening with your implementation, with your multi-tier system of support, what's happening academically, and what's happening with the behavior support that you're providing all of your students. How are you supporting all your students? What is the data saying that those systems that you put in place, what kind of impact are those systems? And we're conveying that with our stakeholders. So some guiding questions for 1.15 is there an evaluation conducted for Tier 1 systems? Are we conducting that yearly evaluation? Are the outcomes shared with all stakeholders, faculty, students, family, board members, superintendents, etc.? Are the outcomes clearly linked to a Tier 1 action plan? And then lastly, is progress compared from year to year? So how are we tracking what we did last year, what we did in 2021 with what we did in 2022? So you need to have some type of student information system to allow you to track that data, or some type of data system to be able to track that. So some culturally responsive practices for data for equity is one, teams report disaggregated data patterns to demonstrate the efficacy of systems for all students. The teams and stakeholders compare disaggregated data trends to school mission and vision. And again, if you think back to your Tier 1 training, our expectations on our implementation should be very connected to our school mission and our school vision, where we want to see the kids or the students go, our goals for our school or our organization. Teams actively seek and incorporate family and community feedback and evaluation. Teams utilize existing community stakeholder groups to guide evaluation. Teams hold community outreach and discussion sessions to present annual evaluation results. And lastly, annual evaluation results are available in multiple languages and modes of delivery. So now we're going to go in and talk about TFI reports. And as I said earlier, if you choose to use PBIS assessments, which is a free resource, then you are able to generate reports based on the data that you enter in to that TFI, for that TFI, and the scores that you enter in. As I said, in order to use PBIS assessments, someone must serve as the assessment coordinator and complete that application to get access to that. That person will be responsible for opening and closing surveys and monitoring that data on PBIS assessment. I'll put a link in the chat, in the description box, that'll help you get to the PBIS assessments in that form. So there are several reports that you can generate from PBIS assessments based on that TFI data that you will enter into the PBIS assessment system. So the first report is that total score report. So this report is going to give the overall implementation percentages for Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. So if you are entering in data for all three tiers, then this report is going to give you that data and give you an overall score for all three of those years. This report also allows you to, all three of those tiers. It also allows you to look at yearly trends, because you will be able to set a custom date range. So the team should use this report when they have all three tiers in place and they've done the TFI for all three tiers. The second report is the scale report. This report is going to give the overall implementation percentages by tiers. So as you can see, it will give you the overall implementation scores for Tier 1, for Tier 2, for Tier 3, whichever tiers that you have entered into the system. Always remember that teams should aim to receive at least a 70% on each tier. Research says 70%. The consultant in me says we should be aiming to be higher, closer to 100%, but 70% is the minimum score that a team should be trying to achieve through their implementation planning. The other report is the Subscales Report. This report gives an overall implementation percentage for each subscale of each tier. So as you can see, for Tier 1, it gives a a subscale report for teams, how you scored in the team subscale, how you scored in the implementation subscale, and for the evaluations subscale. And as you can see, the subscales look just a little bit different in the other two tier TFIs. And as I said, the second video will go over Tier II TFI. So this is a good report. You can also use this report to capture trends from year to year because it allows you to set your date range. So the next report we're going to talk about is going to be the next report we're going to talk about is going to be the items report. So this items report is going to list each item score along with the score. So this is going to be a valuable report for action planning. So this is going to list all of those TFI features and what your team scored yourselves in those individual items. This is going to help when you are getting ready to do the action plan, which we'll talk about in a second. And again, this is a report that you can set the dates, the date range to get dates, and also be able to look at how your scores have changed or progressed over time. So now we'll move into this concept of action planning. So after you've completed that TFI, the next step is to create that action plan. This action plan serves as our compass, or that team's compass, to understand what they need to do in order to move towards fidelity with the PBIS implementation. Now, when you go online, there are tons of different action plan templates that you can find online and that you can download. So there's no one specific action plan, but you want an action plan that is going to allow you to be able to write down what needs to be done, what resources you're going to need, who's going to be responsible, and that timeline. So again, this is a document that you can find. There are some documents, there are some templates that you can find on pbis.org. Various state websites, various state PBIS websites have different templates. And so this is a template that you can use to, you can find or you can create yourself. So the first step when a team is creating that action plan is to provide that team with a copy of that individual items report so everyone can see how you scored in each of those items. The next step is to enter the current score for each item into the action planning form. So you want to make sure that you have that entered in. And this is my particular form. Some forms may not require you to create that, put that current score in. But I like to just do it so that we can, that team can keep track. The next step is, of course, we want to celebrate the things that we're doing good in. So we want to celebrate the twos, celebrate where you're doing well. The next step, step 4, is to identify the areas with a 0 or a 1. And what you want to do is prioritize the top 3. I would suggest any area that you have a 0 in, those are some of the areas you want to provide a focus on. And those are some of the areas that you want to prioritize. So I would prioritize my 0s and my 1s, and then I would figure out which of those we're going to make our top priority. And then the next thing is to write the action plan. So you're going to write what we need to do to improve this score or this rating. What resources do we need for this? And who's going to be responsible for doing it? And in what time frame do we believe that we should be able to accomplish this? Always remember that your action plan is a living document, and it's going to it's always going to change as you're moving closer to that fidelity, and as you are putting in more systems that are going to help to improve your PBIS implementation. So some action planning do's and don'ts. The first thing is be sure to share the action plan with the staff and give monthly updates. The more transparent you are, the more buy-in that you will have from your staff. Number 2, review the plan at each PBIS team meeting. This plan should be the center of our meeting. This should be what is guiding and driving those monthly meetings that the PBIS team is having. And for number 3, monitor the progress of the action plan. What are you going to use? And again, as you were creating that Tier 1 implementation plan, there should have been some thought and some systems put in place to figure out how you're going to monitor your plan, your movement in that action plan. So thank you for tuning into this video. Please don't forget to hit like or subscribe. Don't forget to check the description box for some helpful links.